This is Land of Havilah, Genesis 47. In the last chapter, all Israel came to Egypt. Coming up, Joseph will introduce some of them to Pharaoh. Verse 1. Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brothers, with their flocks, their herds, and all that they own, have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they're in the land of Goshen. From among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation? They said to Pharaoh, Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They also said to Pharaoh, We've come to live as foreigners in the land, for there's no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine's severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Comment, this is sort of a sinner's prayer, as in, God, there's nothing for me in my old life. Please allow me to stay in your kingdom where there's plenty. Verse 5. Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Make your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. If you know any able men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. Comment, as we keep reading, we keep seeing this as a history but an allegory at the same time. The allegory or foreshadowing of Christ started in chapter 37 and continues here to chapter 46. There's not foreshadowing in every detail by a long shot, but there are so many foreshadowings we can't help but notice them. In the story of Jacob's 12 sons, we've seen foreshadowing in Joseph that Christ would be one with the Heavenly Father and completely loyal to him, that the Father sent him to Israel, but they rejected him, persecuted him, and mocked him. In the history when they intended to kill Joseph by throwing him in the pit and leaving him there, it was foreshadowing that they killed Jesus and put him in the tomb. Christ rose from the grave to the Heavenly Father as Joseph rose from the dungeon to Pharaoh and was received into glory, honor, and power. From that position, Joseph, or Christ, tested his brothers, found them to be repentant and faithful, and received them to himself in Egypt, or heaven. And as we just saw in verse 6, Pharaoh's so fond of Joseph that he's heartily receiving his brothers. In the same way, God's so fond of Christ that he heartily receives us. In Jeremiah 3:19, God said, How I desire to put you among the children and give you a pleasant land, end quote. That's what Pharaoh's doing here. He's giving them a pleasant land, the land of Goshen. He's happy to do it because he's so pleased with Joseph, and God desires to put us in a pleasant land because he's so pleased with Christ. In verse 6, Pharaoh told Joseph to put his brothers in charge of the royal livestock if they're able. In the same way, Christ might be putting you and me in charge of some things in the future. 2 Timothy 2:12, quote, If we endure, we will also reign with him. Verse 7. Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, How old are you? Jacob said to Pharaoh, The years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they've not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Comment in verse 7, Jacob blessed Pharaoh when he came in, and in verse 10, blessed him again when he went out, which is allegorical for the praise and gratitude we'll give the Father in heaven. In verse 9, in Jacob's assessment of his own life, it's been rough. He was a wrestler from the womb with his brother Esau. He had to flee home because Esau wanted to kill him. For 20 years he served his crooked father-in-law Laban in the heat and cold and through sleepless nights. Laban defrauded him into marrying Leah, and he had to work an extra 7 years for Rachel. His wives didn't get along. 2 of his sons murdered every male in Shechem. He lost his beloved wife Rachel in childbirth. Reuben lay with his concubine. He got a bad report about the sons of Bilhah that they were evil. Most of his sons hated his favorite. His grandsons and Onan were evil, so evil that God put them to death. His son Judah brought disgrace on the family in the incident with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. For years Jacob thought Joseph was dead and mourned over it. Then there was famine. Therefore Jacob told Pharaoh in verse 9 that the days of the years of his life had been few and evil. But now that he's in Egypt, this isn't a bad ending. His life would have been easier if he had rested all along in the assurance that no matter how disastrous things looked and how much work it was, God was taking care of him, and all of it was leading someplace by the master plan of God. Verse 11. Joseph placed his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all of his father's household with bread according to the sizes of their families. There was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For our money fails." Comment: Egypt and Canaan are coming to Joseph bowing because they have no bread. This is foreshadowing that heaven and earth have no choice but to come to Christ and bow. Psalm 72:11, quote, "Yes, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him," end quote. And Isaiah 60, verse 5, this is God speaking to Christ, quote, "Then you shall see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and be enlarged, because the abundance of the sea will be turned to you, the wealth of the nations will come to you," end quote. We see that happening to Joseph. Verse 16, Joseph said, "Give me your livestock, and I'll give you food for your livestock, if your money's gone." They brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses and for the flocks and for the herds and for the donkeys, and he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock for that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the second year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord how our money is all spent, and the herds of livestock are my lord's. There's nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants to Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land won't be desolate." Comment: the people totally sold themselves and everything they had to Pharaoh in exchange for life. Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, speaking of Christ, quote, "The government will be on his shoulders. Of the increase of his government and of peace there shall be no end," end quote. Right now in the story there seems to be no end to Joseph's increase and the increase of Pharaoh. As of Christ's increase there shall be no end. Verse 20, "So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe on them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he moved them to the cities from one end of the border of Egypt even to the other end of it. Only he didn't buy the land of the priests, for the priest had a portion from Pharaoh and ate their portion which Pharaoh gave them. This is why they didn't sell their land." Comment: coming up, the end of the famine. Verse 23, "Then Joseph said to the people, Behold, I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh. Behold, here's seed for you, and you shall sow the land. It will happen at the harvest that you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4 parts will be your own, for the seed of the field, for your food, for them of your households, and for food for your little ones." They said, "You've saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." Comment: Psalm 22:29, quote, "All those who go down to the dust shall bow before him, even he who can't keep his soul alive," end quote. Right now in the story, the people are bowing because they can't keep themselves alive, which is more allegory. To be clear, it's not fiction, it's history, but God used it to foreshadow the future. Verse 26, "Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have a fifth. Only the land of the priests alone didn't become Pharaoh's. Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they got themselves possessions therein and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. The time came near that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please don't bury me in Egypt, but when I sleep with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. Joseph said, I will do as you have said. Israel said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself on the bed's head. Comment. As to the people of Egypt and what happened to them, it depended on who they were. First, in verse 12, there was Jacob's family. Pharaoh gave them bread and land. Consequently, they stayed on the land and didn't have to sell it for bread. Then there were the priests in verse 22. They also kept their land because they had their bread given to them as well. Then there were the rest of the people. In verse 21, they sold their land for bread. So here's a highly speculative question. Since we've been seeing so much foreshadowing, was this foreshadowing as well about Israel, the priests, and the rest of the people? Do Jacob's family represent the Israel of the millennium, and the priests the Gentile believers of the millennium? Gentile believers are, in fact, a royal priesthood, according to 1 Peter 2:9. And Ephesians 3:6 says, quote, the Gentiles are fellow heirs, end quote. As for the rest of the people of Egypt, the ones who had to sell themselves and their land, who do they represent? Your narrator suspects foreshadowing of some type there, but can't put his finger on it. Genesis 48 is next at landofhavilah.net. Genesis 48.